Welcome everyone to this special session on celebrating 125 years of women's suffrage in New Zealand, women's representation in Parliament, and efforts to make parliaments family-friendly. 125 years ago, New Zealand led the world in votes for women in national elections. Interestingly, the leaders of the suffrage movement were motivated by the obvious, that women did indeed have a right to political equality. They were also motivated by something more than that women's votes, and through women's voters, they would bring a unique perspective to elections. And so the hope was, through suffrage, women would have a concrete impact on policies and the way Parliament would operate. In fact, the original suffrage leaders, there was quite a connection with the temperance movement. They sought the vote as a means to limit the devastating effect of alcohol on women and children, which in turn had to do with domestic violence and poverty. So the vote was something that would lead to a real impact for women in terms of policy. We went through a series of step changes in New Zealand in terms of women's political participation. The vote came in 1893, but we had to wait close to about a century until there was full political participation for women. Women were allowed to run for Parliament in 1919. The first woman elected to Parliament was in 1933, and then the first woman cabinet minister was in 1947. I'm particularly pleased to have come up from Christchurch to facilitate this session because Christchurch played a major part in the suffrage movement. Kate Shepherd, who was one of the leaders of the suffrage movement, came from Christchurch once she had immigrated to New Zealand. And Elizabeth McComb was elected in Littleton, and Mabel Howard in Christchurch East. The next steps, really, towards political participation came with a decision in 100 years after the original suffrage vote, a vote in New Zealand to switch voter systems from first past the post to a mixed member proportional system. We know from studies that the form of voting system has a real impact on the diversity of representation in Parliament. So MMP was expected to change the operation and the face of Parliament, to lead to greater fairness in terms of proportionality for all the parties, but more than this, to also bring more diversity into the House. So in a sense, to have the House of Representatives actually look like the population from which it was drawn. This is sometimes called descriptive representation. So there were great expectations for MMP, and particularly for the impact it would have on the representation of women in Parliament. As you can hopefully see, it did indeed have an impact. If you can see the last first past the post election up to the first MMP election, you can see it did indeed have an impact. Interestingly, in terms of where women have come into the House through MMP, again, this was not unexpected. Predominantly, women have come in through the party lists. And in fact, if you look at where women have been elected in our mixed member proportional system since it came into effect, women overall have made up about 40% of all list MPs have been women. You compare that to all electorate MPs, and only 26% of all electorate MPs have been women. So it really does demonstrate within our mixed system the difference between first past the post and a PR list system. Party list systems are known to be far better in terms of bringing diversity into the House. Another real expectation of more women coming into Parliament is that the boats would rise with the incoming tide. In particular, people were looking for more women also to make their way upwards into cabinet, which is, of course, the powerhouse of our parliamentary system. Again, you can see the impact of MMP. Another boat that would rise has to do with the ultimate leadership. Prior to MMP, we had no women in the role of Prime Minister. Now, since MMP, we are in our third female Prime Minister. In fact, if you look at the time spent in Parliament post-MMP, a majority of that time, New Zealand has been led by a woman in the role of Prime Minister. So MMP has certainly made a difference. And to put it into perspective, when the Right Honourable Helen Clark was elected in 1981, she would have turned around to look, perhaps, at fellow women who had been in Parliament and had the role of MP. She would have had 16 women to look to. Because prior to 1981, only 16 New Zealand women had ever been elected to Parliament. Now, granted, quite often they had multiple terms, but in terms of representation in the House, women never hit double digits before Helen Clark had come into Parliament. So what you can see then is a really big change. But with an initial breakthrough and up to about where women are roughly, on average, about 1/3 of the House, we have had an exceptional year last year where a record number of women were elected to Parliament, but roughly it's been around 1/3. And it's been staying rather static at that point. Similarly, what you can see in Cabinet as well, a rather static position for women in terms of being fully inside Cabinet. So why is that? Well, partly because you have to remember that MMP is a mixed system. And our mixed system actually has more electorate MPs than list MPs. Women predominantly come in through the list, and yet women have not made the same level of breakthrough on the electorate side for a whole lot of reasons, which perhaps we can discuss later in the session. So I go back now and think of what the original suffrage movement were seeking. It's more than just counting women in Parliament. It's looking for something more substantive than that. And the idea of bringing more women into Parliament the hope is that you create a critical mass. That's a term that comes from nuclear physics. It's the quantity needed to start a chain reaction. So what is the chain reaction that women were hoping for from this greater representation? Well, I would say it's something what I would call substantive representation. It's acting for women and in the interests of women. Finding a Parliament that is family-friendly and certainly a work environment that is women-friendly. Hopefully, also what you would see is a spill-on effect outside of Parliament and into the general population as well, into the workforce, equity around our country. So really what today in this session is about is What have we achieved? What needs still to be done? Where are the blockages? So from the suffrage movement through to today, the representation of women in Parliament and leadership roles more generally, in Parliament and outside, nationally and internationally, where are we in terms of the representation of women? Well, I could not have asked for a better panel to actually lead us through this discussion. We have, of course, the Right Honourable Trevor Mallard, who is the 30th Speaker of the House. And they often say a picture paints 1,000 words, and if any of you Google Trevor, probably the picture that is most likely to come up is him holding a baby sitting in his speaker's chair. And so it's important in the role of Speaker, because a lot of the things that we need to do, perhaps, to make Parliament more family-friendly are things that, of course, the Speaker can take a lead on. Who better than to have the Right Honourable Helen Clark here to speak to us today? The first woman elected Prime Minister of New Zealand, and she was in that role for 3 terms. The first woman to take the role of administrator of UNDP, and in that role, she advanced the welfare of women and girls, has long been an advocate for equality and sustainability. Very pleased as well to have Dr. Gill Greer, who is the Chief Executive of the National Council of Women, an organization that was formed 3 years after the suffrage movement. In 3 years' time, we'll be back here celebrating that anniversary as well. But what an impact Gill has had in her various roles, and certainly what an impact the National Council of Women has had for New Zealand. And lastly, we have a new MP, Kiritapu Allen, who is a Labour List MP elected last year. And she is one of 7 parents with babies under the age of 1 in this Parliament. And I think there are 2 more about to give birth. So it is a real sea change, I think, in terms of when we talk about needing to be family friendly, there's a really good reason for that. I'd also say that Kitty has a background in constitutional and commercial law and has a very interesting perspective and fresh eyes on Parliament. So the format for what comes next is each panelist will make some opening remarks, but really this is your session. We then throw the floor open for questions to lead the panel and to talk about any one of the areas of this topic that you want to explore. So I'll begin with the speaker.
Thank you, Therese. Fellow delegates, I've had the advantage of being with this group for a couple of days now, so I won't sort of stand on ceremony or do a lot of formalities. The first point that I'd make is that early childhood education and the way young children are treated have been a passion of mine for a very long time. I was the licensee of an early childhood centre 43 years ago and spent quite a lot of time when I was Minister of Education focusing on that because I think it's important for the children, but it's also important for the families, especially for the mothers, to have quality arrangements in that area. It took, I think, 75 years after women got the vote until the first mother had a baby while a Member of Parliament, Whitu Kiritapu Sullivan, 50 years ago now. But notwithstanding the fact that that was quite a long time ago, we didn't make and haven't made the progress that we should have, and that was exemplified for me by reading of the experiences of Holly Walker, a Green Member of Parliament who had a child when she was a Member of Parliament, and Holly was not well supported by her party colleagues. She wasn't well supported by the parliamentary system, and she wasn't well supported by her friends, and I would put myself in that category, and that meant that it was a very bad experience for her. And that was, I think, learning about that for me reinforced the importance of making the place family friendly. As indicated, we've got 7 at the moment. I don't think we're going to get more than 7. I think that there's going to be some dropping out from being under 1 as the other ones coming in. In fact, the numbers might overall go down. But it is, with that number of young parents, very important that the place be family friendly. The babies in the chamber, I think, it's important for bonding, it's important for feeding, but I think there's probably more symbolism in that. There are messages to be taken from that that are very important, but there have been practically some big things and some small things that have occurred. For me, probably the most important one has been the approach that we've taken to leave of members with young children, and just about all of our of the members who have children under 1 have taken advantage of more flexible leave arrangements which we are implementing for them. Effectively, they get proxy votes for the people who are who come from different voting systems. We don't have a pairing system in New Zealand, but effectively they get proxy votes after an application to me, which has been liberally approved and interpreted. The other useful big thing, I think, has been flexibility to support caregivers' travel. It is very hard to move around the country with a young child and to come to Parliament with a young child, and having some flexibility over and above what is normally available has been important and has made it easier to bring babies to Parliament and to have proper bonding, which I think is important. There've been a lot of minor things, high chairs, access around this building for caregivers. We've got rid of a number of our rules about where people are allowed to go and not go. We've opened up the atrium, which is a really peaceful area. There's quite a lot of baby feeding and baby playing goes on in there. The ban on children in the swimming pool has been lifted, and we've now got to the point where we have occasionally baby sessions in the swimming pool, which I think are really good fun. We're going to have a playground out the front, although that is more about attracting families to come to Parliament than being there for the families of members of Parliament. So all of those are changes that have occurred recently. They're sort of designed to give a message that we want our Parliament to be really a House of Representatives. And the fact that people are young, the fact that people are, because we still haven't got our balances right, although Clark Gayford might be helping, around childcare, and we haven't got the gender balances right in that area. It's mainly an issue for women, it's mainly an issue for younger women, and I think if we want a House that's really representative, we've got to address those issues. Thank you.
And feel free to sit at your place, Right Honourable Helen Clark, or you can come up here.
Always easier to stand. Kia ora, talofa, malualalei, whakalofa laha yatu, kia orana, nisambula vanaka, and warm Pacific greetings to all friends from across the South Pacific, Australia, and of course Kiwi friends here. Trevor's talked a little bit about some of the practical changes that have been made to ensure that Parliament's more family friendly, ever more family friendly, as there seem to be ever more young children around. And Therese has given a great factual overview of where we've come from in New Zealand, and I'll probably sort of come over both of those areas a little bit again, because it's, we're rightly proud in New Zealand of having been the first country in the world where women fought for and gained the right to vote, which was 125 years ago, but things did move very slowly after that. And in my work in international development over the 8 years I was in New York, often women in developing countries would be saying, it's so slow the progress we're making. And I'd say, don't be as slow as we were, because it took a long, long time. 1893 and then 1933 before the first woman was elected. And remember, for a number of the early women who were elected, they were the widow of or the daughter of, right? Yep. Elizabeth McCombs was the widow of. Fetu, of course, was a daughter of. Mabel was a daughter of. So there was that sort of pattern, which is a bit more like the South Asian experience of the women who got to be prime ministers and presidents. They were the widow of or the daughter of, generally, to get there. So it did take a long time. And when I was elected in 1981, we were not double figures. There were 8 of us. And it's actually not hard to remember the names of 8 people. In 1981, there were 4 sitting members. There was Fetu, who was a legend. There was Anne Hercus. There was Mary Batchelor, and there was Marilyn Waring. And added to that group of 4 was me, Fran Wild, Ruth Richardson, and Margaret Shields. And then the following election, Cathy O'Regan replaced Marilyn. But these are very, very small numbers. We were under 10% of the Parliament. And I remember when Sir Robert Muldoon made his valedictory speech leaving Parliament and other interviews, and when he was asked what was the greatest change in your time in Parliament, he said, all those women. Well, we weren't many. But of course we were made a noise, I suppose. But as an example of the way things have changed, and actually I think the coming of growing numbers of women into Parliament also helped professionalise the work, because truly this was a bit of a boys' club if you go back to even the early 80s. And part of the boys' club atmosphere was, I used to say there were 3 forms of recreation around here. One exercised this muscle, and that was in the billiards room, which was what you now see as the lovely grand hall. It had 4 billiards tables. And eventually, with, quote, all these women, like 8, they decided the women needed to have somewhere to socialise, because we tended not to play billiards. And so in the corner, immediate corner of this end of the grand hall, there was a curtained area, and it had a few armchairs. And believe me, if you sat in there and listened to the conversation at the billiards table, you learnt quite a lot. But anyway, I never mastered billiards. The other muscles, of course, were this one, which was the bar, and the bar was greatly patronised by men. And then there were the card schools, which exercised these muscles. Well, that really didn't appeal to young women coming into Parliament. So it was very much a boys' club. And I think when Geoffrey Palmer became Leader of the House and Deputy Prime Minister in 1984, he was determined to professionalise this Parliament. And he also made very important changes to the sitting programme through the year, which is vital to make it family friendly. So when I first came, actually, we were elected in November. We were sworn in and had the address and reply debate in April. So Parliament didn't meet between November and April. And then after a month we were sent back to our electorates, and we didn't come back till the last week in July for the budget. And then we sat until Christmas with a lot of midnight sittings. Now, how can people with families deal with that? Well, the boys always had, because they'd, come down to Wellington for the week and mum looked after the kids. But you had growing numbers of women. This was just not tenable at all. We also used to sit Friday mornings, which was awful. So we'd have 3 late nights, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday morning. So Jeffrey's changes in 1984 really made a big difference in starting to adapt the institution. And I think it's probably back in those years that the first parliamentary early childhood centre opened as well, which was an important move, including for the staff to have a facility on the premises. So a lot has changed, and for the better. Look, one of the issues will be, why is it important? And I think it's useful to use that phrase that Hillary Clinton used. It's probably not original, but it bears repeating. And that is that, gender equality is the right thing to do, right? It's right to have gender equality. It is a human right. But it's also the smart thing to do, because institutions that don't look like their society are just not in touch. And a parliament which had, well under 10% women just wasn't in touch. Now, what I also learned in my years at UNDP was that there was a growing body of evidence that said that when women begin to get into parliaments at that critical mass level, the term that Therese used, you see issues come onto the public policy agenda which you never saw on that agenda before, because no one thought they were very important. And you can look at around the world at parliaments with significant numbers of women members who have started to take up issues of support for single parents, which had never been dealt with before, issues of domestic violence and so on. And I think in our parliament, if you did any kind of comparison of the issues dealt with, really over the last 30 or so years as compared with that, would we ever have been talking about paid parental leave under that old representation? Of course not. Would we have been talking about the 20 hours free early childhood education, which Trevor brought forward as Minister of Education in the government that I led? So things do change when institutions look more like the society. And that's not to say, by the way, that every woman is a great champion for women. And it's definitely not saying that men aren't great champions. We've had great champions. Trevor is one of them and always has been. But the important thing is women have a right to be represented equally, and actually you will get changes in the institutions of parliaments, and you will get changes, I think, in the kinds of issues which are deemed to be important and will come to the top of the policy agenda. Just a quick comment on supplementing what Therese said about the effect of the electoral system. First past the post is the hardest system anywhere in the world for women to break through in. Why is that? Because the image has always been of a man with a wife and a family. And that's what, those of us who were crashing through had to crash through. And it still hasn't happened much in a lot of societies which cling to that form of political representation. Whereas once you get lists, parties are under pressure to make their representation more diverse, because there's not much point going out and appealing for women's votes if you don't think it's important enough to have women well represented on lists, or indeed members of other sections of the community, whether it is Indigenous people in our society, also Pacific people are a significant sized minority, LGBTI community, and so on. Our parliament today looks much more like our society, which is a very, very good thing. So, in summary, I think at 38.7%, I think women's representation is at now, 50% is within grasp. It needs another heave or two probably. But if the political parties pay it attention and start looking at the construction of their lists, it can be done. Several years ago, I launched a very good publication, UNDP did, looking at practical ways of boosting women's participation in parliaments, and it was actually pitched mainly at the political parties, because it said political parties which are the vehicles through which most of us enter a parliament in a democracy, they can be the greatest champions of gender equality or the greatest opponents. So let's convert them to being champions, because that's the way you're going to see the significant lift in representation. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou. I'd like to acknowledge the people of the land in whose place we meet today, and the journeys that you have all made from your places across the Pacific for this mahi today. It's a great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to go back briefly to where we began, but yes, to say firstly, no, I'm not a parliamentarian, but I did try, unsuccessfully, so I have a little understanding of the challenges of the people that are here who are parliamentarians and those of you who work with them, and considerable admiration as well. So, 125 years ago, just down the road from here, this sign was displayed on a Wellington house, and it read, "Notice to electioneering women. Electioneering women are requested not to call here. They are recommended to go home, to look after their children, cook their husbands' dinners, empty the slops, and generally attend to the domestic affairs for which nature designed them. By taking this advice, they will gain the respect of all right-minded people, an end not to be attained by unsexing themselves and meddling in masculine concerns of which they are profoundly ignorant." So 125 years ago, and at the same time, here in this very building, another parliamentarian was speaking, and he said, "It cannot be questioned that all women, physically, and to a large extent mentally, are not fit to be recipients of voting power equal to men." How much of that remains as unconscious bias in the stereotypes and gender norms, I wonder, across our countries? And another, Wirumuperi, gave a warning to us all. "I'm afraid that if ladies were allowed seats in this House, it would distract the attention of some honourable members. If attractive ladies are allowed to come into this House, I'm quite certain my own wife will never consent to my returning here." And what does that say about the psychology, as it was assumed to be, of men at that time? So as you've heard, I'm from the National Council of Women. Most of you will have national councils of women across the Pacific, some of whom I've met when I was Chief Executive of Volunteer Service Abroad, and it was a pleasure to meet some of you at that time. And we are members of ICW. And in fact, today in New Zealand and the Cook Islands delegation, side by side, presenting their reports from their countries and from NGOs to CEDAW in Geneva, and I was on a call at 2 o'clock this morning with them. So we do work together, and we have much to learn from each other. When I was with IPPF, International Planned Parenthood Federation, for 5 years as Director General, we worked in 170 countries. One of their rules was that to be a member association, and some of you will know this, of IPPF, half the board had to be women, and 25% had to be under 20. Why? To help women understand governance, because they knew what a difference that would make, and secondly, to encourage young people. And I want to pick up on that for a moment. In the last 4 years since returning home, I speak every year to 200 young corporate women, young New Zealand women, talented, able, wanting to be leaders, wanting to do work that is values-based. And every year, and the preceding one with a similar group in London, I have said to them, "Would you work for an NGO?" 1 or 2 hands go up. "Would you go on the board of an NGO? Learn about governance?" A few hands go up. "Would you go into Parliament?" Not a single hand goes up. So this year, a few weeks ago, I thought in Auckland, this time will be different. Woman Prime Minister, having a baby, fewer barriers thanks to the work of the Speaker and others, ministers who are women. It'll be different this time. Would you want to be a Member of Parliament? Not a single hand went up. So we need to ask ourselves, as the speakers just suggested, what are some of the barriers? what are the things that do prevent women from taking part? Well, many of you will know the IPU and its research well. So one survey, for example, they conducted a few years ago said the main barrier for women were domestic responsibilities. The main barrier for men internationally were not being well enough known in the electorate. Interesting difference. The second barrier for women, in terms of major barriers, was for them the attitudes of women more generally in society. So if I go back to a survey that we did at the end of last year, the first gender attitude survey done in New Zealand with Research New Zealand, 20% of New Zealanders still believe it is more important for men to be in leadership positions than it is for women. Other countries might be interested in following that survey and seeing what your findings are, because that's what the second barrier clearly is for women. And for men, the second barrier was lack of experience in public speaking, which is quite different again. And what about preparation? We've talked about how do you get people ready for this? How do we help women? And there's a number of things that are being done, but I would say, firstly, encourage them into local government. Here in New Zealand, there are very few young women in local government because the conditions are very, very challenging indeed for them. And of course, the more young women you will get in Parliament, and the more young men, the more young people you will get voting. And if we are to make sure that democracy continues to thrive, that has to be really important as well. We need those voters, we need that engagement and that interest. Until recently, of course, it was very much assumed that men would be the members of Parliament and the members of local bodies, local councils, and the women would stay home and look after the children. And some of that has been driven by unconscious bias, which I've already referred to, but some of it is conscious. And we talk about, can we break the glass ceiling? And I always say, but can we break the glass walls? We've actually got to get women across into the places where they can move up. But let's take the research in relation to business. Research here in New Zealand last year showed that 49% of 500 businesses said the reason they didn't have women leaders in their organisations, in their businesses, was lack of talent in the sector, the organisation, and in women. Now that to me is clearly not the case. Very few of them had gender parity policies or plans, but it indicates how much we have to do. The research tells us that companies with women are more likely to have a better return on capital, assets, and sales, less likely to have staff turnover, greater loyalty, more inclusive and better decision-making, a completely different culture. If that's true for business, surely it's true for Parliament as well, for government, and that's what we need to follow. So you've already identified, and previous speakers have talked about some of the things that can be changed. I tried to sit up last night and write, what would a job description for a woman MP look like? Would anyone ever apply? Would anyone ever apply, in fact, for any job description? And similarly for men. If it's family friendly, it's about family in all its forms, as the UN would say, including rainbow families, diversity of families. It's about support for men. It's about encouraging men. New Zealand men, 1% take parental leave. Encouraging men to take parental leave so that they can take leave from the house as well. So more work, as we're seeing, needs to be done. But without a doubt, I think we can be certain that these same conversations that as we know, are happening not only in your countries, but in Canada, in Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Spain, all over the world. And I think you have the opportunity to go away from here and make some decisions that shows that, once again, the Pacific way can be the way to do it. Kia ora tata. Thank you.
Tuatahi kei te mihi ki a koutou e oku nei raurangatira mai ngā wahi, mai ngā motu o te moana nui a kiwa tēnā koutou e oku nei rangatira. I would love to be able to give the whole range of Pacific greetings that the Right Honourable Helen Clark did, but unfortunately I'm not multilingual enough to do so. But I do want to extend my warm greetings to all of those of you that have travelled from throughout the Pacific our neighbours in Australia and others to attend this conference. And thank you, the Right Honourable Trevor Mallard, our most fantastic speaker, for providing the opportunity. My name's Kitty Allen. I'm one of the younger, newer MPs that came in the 52nd Parliament in September 2017. And when I was thinking over the last few days, what contribution could I possibly make when I sit next to some of the giants beside me? And to put things in context, I was born on the second to last day of 1983. That was a couple of months before the Right Honourable Trevor Mallard was sworn in as a first-term MP when he was about 31, and it was just after, it was about 3 years after the Right Honourable Helen Clark had entered into this here institution. So I thought, oh goodness me, what possibly could I contribute? I guess where I probably landed is that in many ways I am the absolute beneficiary and recipient of 125 years of the work of many, many, many giants that have gone before me. I look to women through a whole range of immense movements prior to 1893 worked together to earn the right to vote. They fought that battle hard and won. And as has been mentioned before, it wasn't until 1933 that we had our first Member of Parliament. In fact, women couldn't stand for Parliament until 1919. The first Māori Member of Parliament, woman Member of Parliament, entered into this House in 1949. Both Elizabeth McCombs, who came in 1933, and Irika Ratana, who came in 1949, both came in off the backs of the deaths of their husbands.
That's right.
It was a long fought path just to be seen in this place. For me, when I grew up, I don't know whether I even knew that this could be a tenable pathway for me. Because it wasn't until 1997, my party, the Labour Party, we're just over 100 years old. And it wasn't until 1997 that we elected our first ever woman leader, who sits beside us today. That was quite a formative time in the life of and I know many of my colleagues, and actually I do want to acknowledge my colleagues, Maya Lubeck, Anahila, Joe Hayes, Lewissa Wall, and there may be some other colleagues of ours that sit at the back of this house. But it was through, in my lifetime at the very least, we had few, but we had strong bastions. Dr. Gill Greer, who has dedicated her lifetime towards women equality. And we also had strong bastions like our allies, Trevor Mallard, who fought when he was as a Minister of Education for things like, for example, 20 hours of free early childhood training. So there were pockets and efforts building. But now, when I came in, and look, it wasn't 50-50, and we do certainly have work to go. But there was a whole range of us, young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, some of us with children in tow. If you hear one crying, that's mine up the back. It felt like I was really, and we felt this collectively, we felt like that we truly were the beneficiaries of so much work that had gone on before us. And I want to speak to some of the modern changes, I think, that have probably enabled young mums like myself to be able to come into this place and feel like it's a place that we can bring our children. One of the fun things, I'll start with the fun thing first because it's my daughter's favourite. My daughter is Hiwi Te Rangi. She was 3 weeks old when I came into Parliament. The Speaker, one of the first things he'd done just before we came in was enabled families to use some of the recreational facilities here, which wasn't possible to do prior. He mentioned that we have baby caucuses in the parliamentary pool. Sounds silly, but it's actually pretty cool, and it's kind of a bonding thing that we do, and that can be members from across each side of the house. Doesn't matter what parties we come from. You know, if we've got kids, we're in the pool splashing about. Something else, I think. Look, and there was a lot of attention given to Trevor at some point, sitting with 2 babies in his chair in chambers. Being able to, in those first few months, this is when baby really, we were new parents. Baby needed to be by us a lot. Being able to take baby in and out of it changed at that time for us. Was very, very important and useful. Look, it's not very helpful at the moment. She's 10 months old and she makes far too much noise, and it's more of a distraction than anything else, much to the speaker's displeasure. But in those initial months, and particularly before...
Not the distraction, I like the distraction.
yeah, the displeasure,
Much
I
better
think.
than most of the noise in there.
Look, he says that he was more responsible and makes far more greater contribution than some of us, I think. But look, the fact that we could just have that time and be able and flexible to bring our children in the house, we sit up the back sometimes and just let them nurse, and little things like that. In those initial months, for us at the very least, it was very, very helpful, and I know that was the same sentiment shared by some of my colleagues. But I just want to acknowledge some of the challenges and the areas I think that we have to make some, I just think sometimes we don't really talk about the challenges because we're in an era at the moment where it's really important to speak to women's ability to do it all. But the practicality is that there is some real challenges with being a young parent, operating as a parliamentarian. Many of you will all know we travel a lot, and we work very long hours in this in chambers here. In 2014, there was an amendment to the travel rules for spouses, which effectively meant that spouses it wasn't even just spouses, it could be a nominated person to that point. But you could have somebody travel with you as a Member of Parliament pretty much freely. In 2014, that was amended to be spouses only, and only when you were accompanying your parliamentary spouse on parliamentary business. For us as new parents, that was very challenging because the allocation is 20 trips per year. That meant essentially it's about one there and back trip from our domestic residence, which is away, to Wellington per sitting. That meant that we had to spend a lot of time apart in those initial months. So I did look into the rationale for why the rules were changed, and sometimes I didn't really understand them myself. I'll put a letter to the Speaker. But those types of limitations, and because sometimes they sound politically quite good to get tough on, entitlements for MPs, etc., some of the practicalities about being a new Member of Parliament with young children, things like the ability to travel with your family, particularly in those first months, that's been a real challenge for some of us. And the second part is that the person now has to be a spouse. And I know that meant you couldn't travel with a caregiver, so that's also been quite a restrictive factor up until very, very recently. So, look, I think that there's a lot of, we've come so far. I want to thank all of those people that have come before us and for making the movements that they have. Some have moved mountains, some have moved millimetres, some have moved inches. But we truly are in a different time. Whoever would have thought that just 125 years ago you would have, actually I hope they would have thought. I hope that they would have thought that this Parliament would have been filled with colourful young men and women from all walks of life, and I think that our Parliament is working towards that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the floor is open to you to ask questions and to generate a bit of a discussion between our panelists. We'll ask the panelists to stay seated for this, and please, by all means, jump in and have a freewheeling discussion. Does anyone have a question they would wish to put to the panelists?
Thank you. This morning and over the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about family-friendly changes to sitting hours to accommodate those arrangements. So my first question is trying to find that balance between being a family-friendly parliament and making those adjustments, but also making sure that you manage the business of the House so that the bills get through. I'd be interested in your view about how you've managed that, or what ideas you have about making sure that both of those things can happen. And my second question goes to some of the changes that you've already made here, and we've listened to some of those from Kiri as well. I'm just wondering, are there any other things that you are considering doing in this Parliament that would further advance the opportunities for it to be family friendly?
Okay. Well, I might try and run those two questions together, because I think there's a bit of what we could do which would help a lot get business through. There are a couple of things which I've wanted to do that I have not been able to do. Because I haven't been able to get the support of our business committee, which is where you get cross-party support for changes. The first is a really simple one, and that is that I think that when there is a caregiver wants to bring a baby to its parent, then the caregiver should be allowed to come to Parliament, not be treated as a stranger. At the moment, the baby is like a parcel, and the baby has to go. Our messengers are lovely, but having to give a baby to a messenger to give it to when it's in need of nursing and have it handed on, I think is unnecessary and unsettling and shouldn't have to happen. There's another area where I've been knocked back, and that is getting some flexibility at the end of the week for travel, not for just people who have babies, but possibly for everybody, or certainly those who have families at home. We've got a regional airline, which is, I'm not going to enter into the criticism of it, because it's quite a political thing here at the moment, but it has been pretty bad as far as regional flights are concerned. And so we have members that in the Northland, Tauranga, Gisborne, Wanganui, Invercargill, and I'll use the Invercargill example, where for missing a plane by about half an hour after Parliament sitting, they can't get it, they have to fly to Dunedin and they get a 3-hour taxi to go to Invercargill, which gets them home after midnight and very tired, and then they get on with their work as an MP on the Friday. My view is we've got a pretty good proxy system. How about just being a bit more flexible at the end of the day on a Thursday, and let some people who it makes a big difference to get away? But again, that hasn't been supported. As far as getting the business through, I think we can use our system of running either the committee stages or non-controversial bills while our select committees are sitting much, much more than we do. We already do it. We have extended sittings and we do it maybe once a fortnight. There's no reason why we couldn't do it a lot more and have a lot of the technical and non-controversial stuff go through at that time, and therefore use that as a method for shortening up. But I would, if I was going, that would be to the government's advantage to do that. But what would be to the government's disadvantage, and I think should be the trade-off, and that should be that urgency should be for emergencies only, rather than just the government's not properly organised today, and therefore will take some urgency to get something that they should have planned for better. So I think if we did a trade-off to let the government get some stuff more stuff through, and not have urgency, I think that could help a lot. That would also make the place much more predictable for families, because you'd know when it was going to finish, and it wouldn't suddenly come back the next day. I think long term, we've got to look at what the Europeans do. Under their list system, they have substitutions. They have someone can go on leave for a period of time, actually most often to be a minister, and then come back as a member of Parliament, and they have someone else on the list takes their role as an MP. And I think we need to, big electoral act changes and a lot of debate for that to happen, but I think that could help make the place a lot more family friendly.
Yeah, from my experience, I think Trevor's making some really useful suggestions, because the truth is we don't have a lot of sitting time for the volume of legislation that we have. So if it were freed up so that Parliament could get on with routine stuff on, say, a Wednesday and Thursday morning while committees are sitting, I think that would be quite a useful innovation. And as you say, Trevor, the trade-off would be there'd be less urgency because you'd be making use of those, 3 to 4 hours on those mornings, which, most people aren't. A lot of people aren't on select committees at that time, and
they're here.
And they're here, so it would be a good use of their time.
Could I just possibly add something as well? From the outside, which is, I think it's critically important to do the business, we need the policies and the laws that will drive diversity and inclusion and result in true gender equality and equal opportunity for all. Secondly, I think there is a role, which is what you're discussing, which is very much about then how does Parliament itself implement the laws it passes, the well-being, for example, that is intended next year with the Living Standards Framework. And thirdly, I believe Parliament has a critical role to walk the talk, because until it walks the talk, we will not see the private sector. Increasingly, we are seeing the public sector, but we won't see this happen. So to me, it's absolutely how do you get that mix of those three major responsibilities.
Kitty, what would make the biggest difference for you as a mother of a young child?
Yeah, look, I've spoken a little bit earlier around some of the travel limitations with your small family unit, particularly in those initial first 6 months. And the other, probably most substantive change, I'm not sure, Trevor, just give me a glare if you want me to stop talking about it, but there has been some amendments made to the way in which compassionate leave has been granted to parents who are parents of children under 6 months and under 12 months. Those amendments essentially allowed for, particularly when the child was in its first 6 months, that there was a high degree of flexibility to when compassionate leave would be granted, and post 6 months to 12 months, again, quite a level of flexibility. And what compassionate leave is for us, I'm sure it might be similar across most houses, but effectively it doesn't go towards your numbers in the house. So for me, one of my other jobs is I'm one of the party's junior whips, so we've always got to make sure we've got the right amount of people who can, and granting leave is a challenge. So what compassionate leave enabled us to do, particularly for those new younger parents of younger children, it enabled those parents to be able to respond to the children in those times which are quite high need, initial 6 months and up to that 12 months. But it also enabled the body of the Parliament to be able to continue with the work that we needed to do. I didn't get a glare, so I continued.
Thank you. John Ajaka, President of the New South Wales Legislative Council. Thank you very much for what's been said. The question I'm asking is in relation to a parents' room. Recently, we reopened a parents' room at the New South Wales Parliament that had moved from a very small space that clearly wasn't affected to a room that is divided into 3 separate rooms. One for babies, in particular to sleep, one for toddlers who can, in a sense, run around and watch TV, do whatever, and one for the parents to be able to sit at a desk, use a computer and continue to work if they want to. We've noticed that's had a very big impact for our members who are new mothers with babies, but also a big impact on their partners, being able to come to Parliament with them and assist and be able to use. We're now looking at and examining whether we in fact hire a daycare worker in that parents' room during parliamentary sitting days on a full-time basis, so that is one form. I'm just wondering if anything like that occurs here, or if you would feel that would make a difference.
Well, I'm going to toss over to Kiritapu in a second, but when I came, we had a wives' room. There was a big change, and it became a spouses' room, and it's now a family room, and is used for those purposes. But I understand, and I'm not over the top of it, that there have been 1 or 2 other places. I think as Speaker I'm not meant to know about it, it might have been co-opted by members, spaces that have been co-opted by members and are used for those purposes.
That may be true, Trevor. Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of interesting points there. We don't have a separated room in the way that you've spoken about, but we do have a room just by chambers that allows members to come in and out, and particularly in the first few months of that child's life when you're nursing a lot, it's heavily used by families. The second thing is, and there's been discussions amongst members with younger children, because of our sitting hours, because of the fact that we travel into Wellington and are out, our primary base is external, so we have our primary childcare, for example, out in our various regions, but you can't kind of pop in and out of childcare facilities, so it's actually very hard for members to get care for children on a temporary basis. So that's been a very recent topic of conversation of some gusto, and I do wonder whether there might be a time when we do get together and consider petitioning the Speaker about being able to engage somebody on precinct. I don't know whether we're quite there yet, but from my personal perspective as a parent, it'd be immeasurably helpful.
Hold it close. Good morning. My name is Kizzy Pyrrhic from the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly. My question is probably to the three New Zealander panellists, the women, that is. Sorry, Speaker. I hear all the information about, making the Parliament a friendlier place, a better place for families, young mothers, young fathers, for example. But what about outside of the Parliament? What work is New Zealand, the Council for Women, or the New Zealand Parliament, or any other agency for that matter, either thinking about legislation or making other workplaces family friendly, like the boss of a bank over here who may be a woman, or a woman who's in charge of a government department? Are they also being encouraged to have family friendly workplaces?
There's been for many, many years an Equal Opportunities Trust that has pushed this a lot to have family-friendly, people-friendly workplaces. And over my years as PM, I often used to go to the annual awards and hand out the prizes. So I got to see a lot of employers come across the stage, and they were in the public sector, they were in the private sector, and workplaces like the Navy or whatever. And these were workplaces that the Trust worked with to really improve the way in which they supported people in the family context. Because when you employ someone, you have to know this is a living, breathing human being who has a family context around them, and they do have needs, and there has to be some flexibility and some give and take. The bigger ones, of course, can do the early childhood centre on the premises, but they all need policies which are permissive of parents having to take time for the sick child, the appointment with the school, whatever. So that's had quite a push. But Gill will undoubtedly be more up to date, and maybe Kiritapu and Trevor about what happens these days. But it's been left pretty voluntary, I think. But there are good examples out there for others to build on and live and learn from.
Yes, just to say that of those 500 organisations that were surveyed by Deloitte for Westpac, the major factor cited by women that would make a difference would be good preschool education on site. And we did really well in New Zealand in that, in the you wouldn't remember, in the 80s probably, and it really is time for another push in that direction. It does make a phenomenal difference. So the university, for example, has 6 different creche and kahangareo here in Wellington for staff and for students. And I think it's some of those institutions can make a real difference.
Kitty, do you have anything?
Not so much. Yeah, I've covered it off.
Andrew Young from the Victorian Parliament. Wanted to follow up on the point made about travel policies and ability to travel with partners, etc., or carers, which I think is a really good one. And that leads on to a question about the role of media. And because I think, certainly from an Australian perspective, the great fear, of course, is that as soon as you go into that territory, you'll get a very negative response from media. There'll be a front page talking about snouts and troughs. And so I wondered if you could talk to the experience of the media in New Zealand and the extent to which they've been engaged in your progress within the parliamentary environment with women's participation, and how you think that could be managed, because I think in Australia that would be the first thing that comes to members' minds about why they don't want to go into that territory.
If I could make a comment, I mean, there's always been a media constituency for cutting back on members' conditions of service, right? And, you know, sometimes you wonder whether there'd be some expectation that you'd work for nothing at all. And the problem is when you can't start sort of cutting back on conditions of services and letting salaries erode, that's when you open the way really for corruption if people, aren't properly paid, sad but true. But I think on the travel, probably the fact that our new Prime Minister has a baby and her partner's going to need to travel with that baby.
I'm sort of...
Isn't that...
No,
I mean, there are rights, but the point is no one would want to question a partner travelling with a child to bring them to Parliament, right?
That's right. Except that after Helen there was another regime, and I don't want to get into highly political stuff, but I think it's fair to say that the family wealth meant that what members of Parliament received were not as important to the former Prime Minister as they were to the vast majority of members of Parliament. And what that meant was that there was a lot of tightening up, and that included the travel of, well, it included tightening of the definition of who could travel with a Member of Parliament, and it had a restriction in the number of trips that person could do, back down to 20 individual trips for an ordinary Member of Parliament and 30 for a minister, although the Prime Minister's spouse is unlimited. So it is very tight. There's a question about whether members of Parliament want to go there, because it's actually tightened up by legislation now. Previously, it was an area for Speaker's direction. It's now been legislated, so there'd have to be an Act of Parliament, select committees, and whether people want to go there. The one I think good thing that happened was that we went from having sort of scandals and stuff always being in the paper to we now do quarterly reporting on total travel. So everyone's travel broken up by, what you've got for driving on the surface, what accommodation you've got in Wellington paid for, what accommodation you have out of Wellington paid for, and your airfares within each of those groups totalled up and published every 3 months. And for the first 2 or 3 times it was published, it was really interesting news. And I think it's probably about 2 years since I've seen any comment that's flowed from it at all, apart from one minister who didn't understand how internal affairs in New Zealand basically quintuple the cost of a driver in a car, because they do overheads on overheads on overheads through a very bureaucratic system, and people get charged. I don't use a Crown car to go home at Wainuiomata at night. It costs me about $65 in a taxi. When it's a Crown car, it's $350.
Just building on Trevor's point, though, I think there's an equity point to be made. So our Prime Minister with the young baby, her spouse, I now learn, has unlimited travel. But what about a young mother who's not a minister, obviously not the Prime Minister, whose spouse is very restricted on travel? So there are equity issues, and those need to be thought about. I mean, whether there's the political appetite to tackle them, I don't know. Probably only if the babies were well represented across all parties would it perhaps open it up to be revisited. But prima facie, it isn't right.
Sure.
From the point of view of someone who's been an employer of quite a large, few hundred volunteers and a staff of around 70, one of my questions would be, how would the 2015 Health and Safety Act apply to Parliament and those working in Parliament as parliamentarians and as staff? And I would think there would be a number of challenges that would need to be addressed that would perhaps provide rationale, but I'm sure greater minds than mine have thought of that already.
I think that you've really hit the nail on the head. The fact that the discussion's going to be perpetuated by the media, right? And that influences the way in which public opinion will swing. I feel like there is definitely, I don't know that there'd be the political will to increase, members' travel allowances after they were cut back in 2014, and that's a real issue because it means that we effectively, you inherit the environment that we've got, which was, without getting political, a lot less family focused and friendly just a few years ago than it was under the previous, under the administration of the Right Honourable Helen Clark, and it is under this current government now too. So that's the issue. It's political. We can't do a lot about it. But I think that, we must at least state that there is an equitable issue. Well, yes, it is. It's an equitable issue, and it's one that we probably just have to turn our heads and nod to unless there's a real turn and tide of public opinion in terms of letting members of Parliament get perks, but I can't see that happening.
Can I just make one other point and say, I'm going to be trying to say this really carefully, but we've got a long way to go on gender equality as far as the roles of parents is concerned, and still the majority of young parents in the Parliament are males, and they're not their baby. They're not the primary caregivers. And until we get more young woman MPs, who want to travel with their babies, I think we're not going to get the pressure. I mean, we've got some attitudinal things about who looks after babies to be considered pretty carefully in order to develop the case for change. And it almost, sometimes it seems like to me as a parent of the early 70s, actually our attitudes generally in society haven't changed that much since that time, and we need to.
Well, the proportion of those who take parental leave who are fathers is pretty small, right? Is it 10%, if that? Probably less. So that makes your point, I think.
Yep.
And it's chicken and egg, isn't it? You won't get the young women who are mothers who want to travel with their babies while the barriers exist as they are.
Yep.
So it is chicken and egg in many ways, I think. I mean, certainly if we know that domestic responsibilities is the major barrier, if I think of 4 years of my very informal survey of a couple of hundred women, very able, very committed, very passionate about all sorts of things, they don't want to enter Parliament.
We have a question over here.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sheree Morris-Tafatu, the clerk of the new Legislative Assembly. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge all the great women and the great men who are here today, because I believe that, both genders do contribute towards the development of any country. Now, it seems to me that parliaments over a long period of time, they have become very inclusive. Now, the question that I would like to pose to the fellow, my Pacific Islanders, because I do believe that, like you, Dr. Gill, I ran for Parliament last year in May. Unfortunately, I was also unsuccessful. So I was trying to figure out why is it that, the women, they weren't supporting women in getting into Parliament. But then one of the reasons why they told me it's because you're doing such a great job in education want you to leave. I said, but that's not a very good rationale for not, voting for me. However, in the Pacific countries, we have this challenge in relation to our culture. Now, our culture by way of being Christians, that it is a woman's place to be in the kitchen, raising children, and so forth. Now, in asking some of the speakers and clerks from various Pacific Island countries, how do you face the challenge of such a perceived notion that that is where a woman's place is? And most probably in the next round, I may run also for Parliament in Niue. But firstly, I'd like to ask from you, parliamentarians or speakers or clerks from the region in the Pacific, how do you face this challenge that is before us? Thank you.
It's not a challenge unique to Pacific Island countries, right? I mean, to get women established as a viable political force in New Zealand, we had to put non-traditional roles behind us as well. And this was a pretty traditional place. If you go back to the 40s, when women married, they had to resign from the public service. Now, we had the period of World War II, 39 to 45, and a lot of men went and served overseas. So the women then, please come out of your home and come and do the jobs the men aren't here to do. When they came back, women were expected to go home, right? So that's the kind of New Zealand that I was brought into. I didn't know when I was a child very many women who worked at all, right? They weren't in the paid workforce. Interestingly, my father's two sisters both kept working. One was a teacher and one ran a grocery store with her husband. This was very unusual. Generally, women were at home. So when you stepped forward, as a baby boomer to say, you're running for Parliament, this did take some breaking through. And I remember all the prejudices from back in that 80-81 period when I was first running. The people who said, she'll never go well at the bowling club in the RSA. And this is a working man's seat, they said. Well, the working men had daughters and wives and mothers, many of whom also voted. But, these were the perceptions that you had to break through. So the Pacific Island countries have among the worst representation levels of women in the world in their parliaments. Fact, right? Last Papua New Guinea election elected no women. I think the height was 3 in a previous parliament. Sometimes Dame Carol Kidu was the sole woman elected. It's tough, but I just have to urge the women to keep going and to build alliances of women and men who will support them, because your parliaments are the poorer for not having the women's voices. And, often we hear, the women are powerful, but it's behind the scenes. Well, why should they have to be behind the scenes? Why aren't they at the top table helping make the decisions and shape the policy agenda? We can't accept that our role is to be behind the scenes. I never did. And nor, I think, should anybody else.
Can I just comment there firstly from a personal point of view? My mother-in-law would not let me work once I had children. I was a teacher, so I gave up teaching. Secondly, my husband decided that we would move firstly to Hamilton and then to Wellington without any discussion at all with me. So that's how much agency, if you like, I had. That said, change is possible, and for the suffragettes, they were helped by men, just as the Speaker and other male colleagues in the House are supporting women parliamentarians on some of these moves around flexibility. And secondly, I've worked, as has Helen, with parliamentarians, groups of women parliamentarians, both in Uganda and Rwanda, both of whom were outstanding, and I had larger groups attend meetings that I was there for than anywhere else in the world. They were paid less because they came in as if they were on the list, but what a difference they made. And so that quota system, and I know it's not a popular notion, but it has driven change, and that change is reflected in policy and in the economy of those countries as well. So those are a couple of thoughts in relation to that.
Tēnā koe. I also too want to make a brief comment, because there's been a whole broad range of amendments as well by very, coordinated and organised groups of women from a range of different organisations. For example, within our party, we had a range of constitutional amendments that might not have been publicly that popular, but actually really resulted in the 2017 list process that came through. We had our constitutional requirement was to seek a target of 50% caucus comprised of women. And as Dr. Therese examined before, a majority of our members of parliament come in New Zealand on our women members of parliament come in on our parliamentary list. So that list process became very important to have diverse or have woman representation here in Parliament. So there was, for a very long period and sustained period of time, there were people, I guess you could say, party activists or people within our party that really had that focus of trying to see an equitable gender balance, and so forced it to happen through that constitutional amendment process. And so we've got quite a clear target which really was reflected, for example, on that last list. So I guess my comment is that change occurs through a whole range of ways, and finding a whole different range of ways to influence the ultimate outcome, I think, is really important in terms of just a movement for more representation.
I'm going to make a brief comment here, which might end up with me being thrown out of the old boys club. We did an analysis in the 1980s that looked at the 1981, the 1984 and the 1987 elections back in the days of first past the post, which showed that the swing for women candidates who were Labour candidates was better than for the men. You know, sometimes we were going in one direction, sometimes we were going in the other, but the woman had better results. And we did a bit of thinking about that. And the point that we got to was that the women were better. The women actually found it harder to get selections, and once they had got selections, they ended up being better candidates and better members of parliament than the men were.
That's exactly right. We have one more question here.
Thank you. My name is Daisy Allen Momotaro. I'm a member of the Parliament from the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Just want to comment that I was very inspired of all the four speakers. But I think it's a very good opportunity for me to thank the women of New Zealand, the Council of Women, because the women of the Marshall Islands, before I became a member of the Parliament, I used to be an advocate group for the umbrella NGO women's group in the Marshall Islands. And it was through the friendship of the our NGO women's group and the Council of Women in New Zealand that they funded us for 4 years. And during those 4 years, they really built the capacity of our women to have to be confident in running for the local government and also our parliament. And I want to thank, it was UNIFEM Women of New Zealand and the Graduate Women's Group that funded us for executive 4 years, and we were able to bring male partners from all over the Marshall Islands and build our partnership. And from that time on, we were able to, when we ran, the mindset of the men and even women also, they would change. And as you may know, we are out of 33 members of the Parliament, we have 3 women. 2 of them is the head of state, Her Excellency and Madam President Hilda Siaini, and the other woman is she's a member of a cabinet. And myself, I'm the senator. So I just want to thank, and I want to encourage all the other Pacific women sisters, don't be discouraged. As we heard the stories. It's a long way, but we'll be good in the Parliament. And I'm seeing that I have so many, all the males in my members of the Parliament, they've been very helpful. I also chair the committee for the judicial and governmental relations, along with 8 men. And they're very cooperative with me whenever I need their help. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you will agree with me in my assessment that this has been a really worthwhile session. I've been listening to our fantastic panel and the really insightful questions from the audience as well. And I keep, the question in my mind that keeps coming through is, if Kate Shepherd, who led the suffrage movement in New Zealand, if she were here today, and if she looked at New Zealand and at its parliament, what would she think? And I think there are certain things that she would be really happy about, particularly looking at the record number of women that we have in the current parliament in New Zealand, the fact that we have a prime minister who is not just a woman, but is off on leave with her baby, that her partner will be the primary caregiver of that child. Kate Shepherd would look at that and say, you know what, that's probably, what we had in mind. And the fact that over the last while since MMP, we have had 3 women in top roles in New Zealand as Prime Minister. I think she would be happy that Trevor is making these changes in Parliament to make it more family friendly so that people like Kiri can come in as an MP and not be separated from her child. And I think Kate would have actually really liked the statement that Trevor made, was that this is sending a message. It's sending a message to New Zealand, to young people, that this is a parliament that wants to be representative. What would she be most depressed about? Well, 2 things, I think, in terms of what I've heard this morning from the panel. Gill's comment that when she asked a young audience of intelligent, well-educated women who are in quite a high-rising career path, how many of them would be interested in running for Parliament, and not a one put up her hand. So that to me is slightly sad, and I wonder, it makes me wonder how much we're doing a lot in Parliament to make it more family friendly, but the reality is that what most of the public sees is question time. Quite an adversarial, personally at times abusive, and also you see our elected representatives also take quite a bit of a battering perhaps in the media. So there are certain things obviously that people look at and decide that actually this is not a friendly environment for me to get involved in. I think perhaps another thing would be, in the last week or so, we've had a very damaging report come from Dame Margaret Beasley about a culture that was not family friendly or woman friendly in terms of the private sector. And so I suppose the other thing, the suffragettes were expecting was a spillover from Parliament as well into the broader society in terms of women-friendly workplaces, in terms of equity. And we've seen signs that that is not entirely there yet. So what's to be done? Well, the Right Honourable Helen Clark encourages us to aim for equity, political equity, not for women, gender equity, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it is the smart thing to do. And she rightly says we need to think carefully, and parties, if they want to lift gender representation in the House, they need to think about how they construct their party lists. And there's no doubt about that. And in fact, and to pick up Trevor's point, research shows that there's a noticeable symmetry between selection and election. If you talk about the barriers for equality for women to be represented in Parliament, it is really around getting access to winnable candidacies. That is the big hurdle. It's at the selection process rather than the election process. But I would encourage us to go beyond just thinking about where women are positioned on the list, because the fact of the matter is there are more electorate MPs in New Zealand than there are list MPs. And with each redistribution, that gap is getting bigger. So it's really important as well, and I would say specifically to National and Labour, because the electorate seats are dominated by the two major parties, that it's really important as well that we look at selection in the electorate side of the House as well. Because the reality is, and I heard the session in when you were talking about sometimes you have perverse outcomes, unexpected outcomes. For example, of having accommodation in Parliament in Queenstown gave them the license to have sitting hours to go till 12 or
it's not a nice place.
Queensland, to go to have late sitting hours. Well, interestingly, in MMP, really the election outcome is decided by the party vote, which has freed up people to actually separate their electorate vote. In other words, your electorate vote is unlikely to really impact the overall result in Parliament. So what's happened is we have really high incumbency rates on the electorate side. And so on the electorate side, if you want a sustainable career in Parliament, it tends to be by being an electorate MP. So the problem for women is if they're not making the breakthrough on the electorate side, and part of it is because there's long incumbency rates, but instead coming in through the list, turnover on the list, churn on the list is much quicker than it is on the electorate side. So until women are as successful on the electorate side as they are on the list side, it's going to be hard to really forge those sustainable political careers in Parliament. So lots to talk about, and I'm sure you'll want to join me in thanking Trevor Mallard, Helen Clark, Gill Greer, and Kiritapu Allen as our panel today, and thank you for your insights.
Thank you.
My job just to be the monitor again. We're going from here into the Grand Hall. Lunch is the compliments of Commonwealth women parliamentarians, and we have some small gifts for the convener of our panel and our panelists. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, George.